In this section, we're going to cover the Atlantic slave trade in a little bit more depth, and we're also going to look at the African diaspora in the Americas. And if there's time, we'll go over slave resistance and the eventual abolition of slavery. So when you look at the way that the Europeans are brought into the slave trade, led by the Portuguese again, you have to understand that they're tied into existing routes. This is a trade that had existed, but again, the scale is what makes it different under the Europeans. Slaves played a central role in the triangle trade for Europe, Africa, and the Americas. And you have to understand that this chattel slavery or ownership of people was part of the plantation system in the Americas. So in order to have these cash crops, what the Europeans did was import slaves. And cash crops in sugar included sugar, but also indigo and tobacco. Indigo is a blue dye. Now, a big part of this was firearms. Firearms were the most popular items that the Europeans exchanged for slaves, and they were used like by the slavers to procure slaves. Here, you can pause the video and take a look at this map that shows the triangle trade as you would have learned about it last year in American history. Now, as these Africans were brought to the Americas, they brought a lot of their culture with them. And this was pretty incredible because they were coming from different places in Africa. During the height of the slave trade, during the 18th century, over 55,000 slaves a year were exported to the Americas. It's been estimated that more than 12 million Africans arrived in the Americas, while more than 4 million of them died on what's called the Middle Passage. And this is something that we will look further at in class. But it's the passage between, it's basically the passage across the Atlantic. And we'll look at some of the horrific conditions that Africans survived and didn't survive on this voyage. Olaudah Equiano was a African slave who wrote, and then a free person who wrote a depiction of the Middle Passage. You also have to remember that a small minority of kingdoms did profit from the slave trade, and we went over those earlier in the video. Slavery in North and South America was very different, and the slavery led to the foundation of the African diaspora. In the Americas, most slaves, as I said, served on large plantations producing cash crops. And make sure that you remember that the largest one is sugar, but there's also tobacco, rice, indigo, and later on cotton. The nature of the slave trade varied dramatically from one region to another. In North America, where 5% of slaves went, many slaves actually formed families, which increased population. There was definitely extremely harsh treatment of these slaves, but because of the different environments, there was less mortality. In South America and the Caribbean, there was a much higher proportion of slaves that were shipped to these areas, 95%. You do the math. There was an incredibly high mortality rate. We're talking people dying within 1 to 3 years, never able to start a family, never able to even really have a chance because of the heat and the type of labor that people were doing. So here we can see the destination of African slaves. Here we can see slaves depicted working in a mine, or the Spanish. And last but not least, let's get to slave resistance. Slave resistance was extremely common, but just because people didn't have outright rebellions doesn't mean that they weren't resisting. A lot of times they would use slow work or different songs or establishing communities as a form of resistance. One example of a slave revolt, the only successful slave revolt in history that led to the abolition of slavery, was Haiti, which we'll talk about a lot when we get to the French Revolution because the two are linked. This was called Saint Dominique, and it was the most profitable colony in the Americas. Attempts by slaves to preserve languages or cultural traditions from their homeland gradually became more difficult as they were integrated into this new society. And this created a true blended culture. One example of this is in Haiti with the rise of syncretic religions like Voodoo or Vodun. And this was something we discussed in the last flipped classroom. It's the idea of Christianity combined with more mystical religions. One thing that you might remember about voodoo is the role of zombies or voodoo dolls. But there's a whole spiritual world to this. And the abolition of slavery did not happen during our time period that we're looking at. However, there were movements towards abolition or ending of slavery, and these began with the ending of the slave trade, which was by the British, and then the ending of slavery. Um, However, slavery did not end until the mid 1800s in most places. It didn't end until later in places like Brazil. The United States and most European nations outlawed slave trade in the first half of the 19th century, but like I said, other places did not. And many people moved to Brazil in order to continue practicing slavery after the United States Civil War. Slavery hung on in some parts of the world well into the 20th century, and even today it's been estimated that around 200 million people are still living in some form of servitude. So we might think of this episode of history as being done and gone, but there are haunting remnants of it still left in the world. Thanks for watching the Flipped Classroom. Please do the listening check at the end.